There comes a moment when you realize the conversation has already concluded, but the other person hasn't noticed yet. They continue speaking because silence feels like a problem to solve, a void demanding repair. You've stopped needing to fill it. This isn't a technique you learned. It arrived as a recognition that most exchanges are negotiations over who will absorb the other's discomfort, and you've quietly withdrawn your participation from that market. The shift doesn't announce itself. One day you simply notice that you've been letting people finish their explanations without offering your own, not from politeness, but from a growing awareness that your counter-explanation would only extend an interaction that has already given you everything useful it contained. The common advice suggests silence creates mystery or projects confidence, as if it were a costume you wear to influence perception. This misunderstands the mechanism entirely. Silence doesn't create an effect on others. It removes your interference from a system that was already generating information about them. Every person you encounter is continuously broadcasting their position, their anxieties, their leverage points, but most of this data is obscured by your own need to be seen as intelligent, agreeable, or dominant. When you speak to demonstrate these qualities, you're jamming your own receiver. The silence that holds power isn't performed. It's the natural result of no longer needing the conversation to confirm something about yourself. Others mistake this for strategy because they're still using dialogue as a tool for self-construction, and they assume you are too. What usually happens first is you notice yourself explaining less. Someone makes an assertion you know to be incomplete or wrong, and you find you don't particularly want to correct them. Not because you're being generous or diplomatic, but because their misunderstanding is now information. It tells you where their thinking stops, what they need to believe, how they've arranged the world to make themselves comfortable within it. Your correction would only reset the board. You'd get a new, more carefully defended version of the same architecture. So you nod slightly, or say something minimal and the conversation continues. But now you're operating with a map they don't know you're drawing. This feels vaguely dishonest at first, like you're cheating, until you realize that everyone is already doing this who has anything to protect. You've just stopped announcing your position before understanding theirs. The disorientation comes from recognizing how much of your previous communication was a form of supplication. You were offering information to purchase acceptance, volunteering your reasoning to preempt judgment, filling silence because you interpreted it as disapproval. None of this was conscious. It presented itself as sociability, as collaboration, as respect for the exchange. But when you stop doing it, you notice how much effort it required and how little it returned. The person who talks more in a negotiation almost always loses, not because silence is inherently powerful, but because speech is costly. Every sentence you offer is a piece of your position, a hint at your limitations, a display of what you think you need to defend. The quieter person is simply spending less. They're letting you establish the boundaries of the game while they decide whether to play it at all. People fill silence with their priorities. If you stop talking and someone else begins explaining themselves more thoroughly than the situation demands, they're telling you what they fear you're thinking. They're defending against an accusation you didn't make, which means they've already made it against themselves. You didn't have to interrogate them. You just had to stop rescuing them from the minor discomfort of an unfilled pause. This happens constantly in professional contexts. The person who elaborates without being asked is usually the person who feels their position is weakest. They're trying to construct certainty in real time, and they're doing it in front of you because they need a witness to make it real. If you supply agreement or disagreement, you give them something to push against, which stabilizes their performance. If you supply nothing, they have to keep building, and the structure becomes more revealing with each addition. What you eventually recognize is that most people are not trying to communicate information. They're trying to manage their own anxiety about how they're being perceived. The content of their speech is secondary to its function as a regulatory mechanism. They talk to feel less uncertain, to convert the ambiguity of your silence into something concrete they can respond to. When you withdraw that service, they don't become more guarded. They become more expansive. They interpret your silence as attention, which it sometimes is, and they try to fill it with enough material to finally provoke a reaction that tells them where they stand. This is why silence often produces confessions. Not because it's intimidating, though it can be, but because it creates a space that people feel compelled to furnish with meaning, and they use whatever material is most alive in them at that moment. The inversion that nobody mentions is that the less you speak, the more you're assumed to know. Frequent speech is read as a need for validation, which implies uncertainty. Silence is read as sufficiency, which implies position. This occurs even when your silence stems from simple disinterest or lack of knowledge. The other person doesn't have access to your internal state. They only have your behavior, and they interpret it through the logic that governs their own. Someone who talks a lot assumes silence indicates withholding. Someone who manages their image carefully assumes silence indicates control. Someone insecure assumes it indicates judgment. In each case, they're telling you how they operate, and you've learned this without asking a single question. The asymmetry is structural. They're managing two problems at once: what to say and how to interpret your absence of saying. You're only managing one, whether their output is useful. You begin to notice how often people volunteer the information you would have eventually needed, simply because they can't tolerate not knowing what you're thinking. In a hiring context, in a sales interaction, in a negotiation, the person who speaks first about price or constraints or desperation has already lost a degree of leverage they will not recover. This isn't because the information itself is disastrous to reveal. It's because its timing demonstrates need. And need is the foundation of all disadvantage in voluntary exchange. When you become comfortable with silence, you stop volunteering this need. You let the other person construct a narrative about what you want, and that narrative is always built from their own experience of wanting. They tell you what they would want in your position, which gives you their hierarchy of values, and now you know what you're actually negotiating with. There's a cost that emerges slowly. Relationships that were sustained by your participation begin to thin. Friends who relied on your responsiveness to maintain the rhythm of connection start appearing less frequently. Professional acquaintances who interpreted your agreeableness as alignment lose interest when that signal stops transmitting. This isn't a failure of the technique. It's the technique working exactly as designed. It's filtering for people who are comfortable with ambiguity, who don't need constant reassurance of where they stand, who can operate without your emotional labor holding the channel open. What remains is smaller and often stronger. But the transition is alienating. You realize how much of your social world was built on a version of yourself that no longer exists, and that version was more popular than the one you're becoming. The professional advantage is quiet and cumulative. In meetings, you stop being the person who fills dead air with suggestions. You become the person whose silence makes the dead air feel significant, which forces others to fill it with more considered contributions. You're not doing anything. You've just removed the safety net that allowed lazy thinking to pass unexamined. Colleagues begin treating your eventual statements with more weight, not because the content has changed, but because scarcity has altered its perceived value. You say less, so when you do speak, people assume it's because you've determined it's necessary. This assumption does some of your work for you. You're no longer fighting for space in the conversation. The space is held open for you by the same people who used to speak over you when you were more available. In personal relationships, silence becomes a diagnostic tool. The person who can't tolerate it, who rushes to fill every gap, who interprets your quietness as withdrawal or anger, is telling you they need constant feedback to regulate their own state. This isn't inherently problematic, but it's information about what the relationship will require from you. Some people experience your silence as peace. Others experience it as abandonment. The difference matters more than almost anything they'll tell you directly about their needs. You can ask someone if they're secure or anxious, and they'll give you the answer they wish were true. You can be silent for 30 seconds and watch what they do with it, and you'll know. What you start to notice in group dynamics is that the person who talks the most is rarely the person with the most influence. Influence accrues to the person whose perspective feels expensive to access. If you're always available with an opinion, your opinion becomes ambient, part of the background radiation of the group's process. If you speak once after listening to 20 minutes of discussion, and what you say reframes the entire conversation, you've demonstrated that your attention is a limited resource, and now people begin competing for it. This isn't manipulation. It's a natural response to scarcity. You've made yourself scarce by refusing to be constantly accessible, and the group adjusts its behavior around that constraint. The mechanism underneath all of this is about the location of uncertainty. In any interaction, someone is holding the uncertainty about how the interaction will resolve. Will we agree? Will this be comfortable? Will I be accepted? The person holding this uncertainty is at a disadvantage because they're motivated to resolve it, which makes them predictable. When you speak a lot, when you explain yourself thoroughly, when you fill silences, you're taking on the uncertainty. You're working to ensure the other person feels comfortable, understood, resolved. When you stop doing this, the uncertainty transfers to them. They become the one who doesn't know if the interaction is going well. They become motivated to resolve it. And in trying to resolve it, they give you the information, the concessions, the admissions that you would have otherwise had to extract through effort. This is why silence is often mistaken for power. It's not that silence generates power. It's that people who are already operating from a position of sufficiency can afford to be silent, and people who need something can't. The silence is an indicator, not a cause. But there's a reflexive quality to it. If you can train yourself to be silent even when you're not in a position of strength, you borrow some of the signaling advantage of that position. Others can't easily distinguish between the silence of someone who doesn't need them and the silence of someone who has simply learned to withhold the signs of need. Both present the same surface, and people respond to surfaces. There are contexts where this fails completely. In relationships that require vulnerability or intimacy, sustained silence reads as withholding, and it is. The same quality that creates leverage in negotiation creates distance in connection. You have to know which game you're playing. Some interactions are collaborative, and silence in those contexts is just absence. It's not strategic. It's a failure to contribute. The error many people make after discovering the advantages of silence is applying it uniformly, as if every human interaction were a negotiation. This produces a certain kind of isolation that feels like strength, but is often just the absence of being known. You become very good at understanding others and very difficult to understand yourself, and the asymmetry starts to feel less like an advantage and more like a separation. What becomes clear over time is that silence selects for a particular kind of relationship and repels another kind. People who need a lot of verbal affirmation, who process their thoughts out loud, who use conversation to regulate their emotional state, will find you difficult. They won't describe it that way. They'll say you're distant or cold or withholding, and from their perspective, this is accurate. You are withholding the thing they've come to expect from interactions, which is collaborative emotional management. People who are more self-contained, who think before they speak, who are comfortable with their own internal state, will find you restful. They won't describe it that way either. They'll just keep showing up. Over years, your social world will reshape itself around this selection pressure, and you'll end up surrounded by people who don't need much from you, which can be either liberating or lonely depending on what you actually want from connection. Professionally, the same filter applies. Managers who need constant updates and reassurances will find you frustrating. Managers who trust competence and dislike noise will promote you. Clients who want their hands held through every decision will go elsewhere. Clients who want problems solved without having to participate in the solution will increase their budgets. You're not being difficult. You've just made yourself expensive in terms of the emotional labor required to work with you, and inexpensive in terms of the actual output you deliver. Some markets reward this ratio, others don't. Knowing which you're operating in is more important than the technique itself. The identity shift that accompanies this is subtle, but irreversible. You begin to see yourself as someone who observes rather than participates, even when you're actively involved in something. There's a quality of spectatorship that enters your self-concept. You're in the room, but you're also watching the room, and the watching feels more essentially you than the participation. This can be clarifying. It can also be distancing in ways that are hard to reverse. You become very good at reading subtext and very detached from text. The surface level of interactions starts to feel almost irrelevant, like you're watching actors perform a script, while the real communication is happening in pauses and hesitations and things carefully not said. This makes you effective in certain domains and alienated in others. What you give up is a certain kind of ease. People who talk a lot, who are generous with their thoughts and feelings, who maintain connection through constant low-level contact, have access to a kind of social fluidity that becomes unavailable to you. They're not better or worse. They're playing a different game with different rewards. They get to be liked more easily. They get to feel connected more consistently. They also get to be dismissed more readily and understood more superficially. You get to be taken seriously. You get to maintain a certain kind of mystique. You also get to be lonely in rooms full of people and misunderstood in ways you can't correct without undermining the position that made you effective. There's a point where you realize the silence isn't something you're doing anymore, it's something you are. You're not withholding speech strategically. You've genuinely stopped having the impulse to fill space with your perspective, unless you've determined it will change something. Most talk doesn't change anything. It's social grooming, status maintenance, anxiety management. All of this is fine and human and necessary for most people. but you've lost the ability to engage with it unselfconsciously. You see the mechanism too clearly. You know what people are doing when they're doing it, including what you're doing when you choose to participate, and this knowledge makes participation feel like a choice in a way it doesn't for people who are just living inside their communication without analyzing it. The question that eventually emerges is whether you've gained leverage or just isolated yourself inside a strategic posture that no longer serves you. The answer is probably both. You're more effective in certain kinds of interactions and less capable of certain kinds of connection. Whether this is an acceptable trade depends entirely on what you actually value, which is a question most people don't answer honestly. They say they value authentic connection but optimize their behavior for status and control. They say they value influence but are unwilling to accept the loneliness that comes with being the person others can't quite read. The silence reveals this contradiction because it forces you to choose. You can't have the warmth of constant availability and the power of considered scarcity. The behaviors that generate one repel the other. What remains after you've integrated this fully is a kind of calm that other people find either magnetic or unsettling. You're not performing ease. You're genuinely unbothered by outcomes that would distress most people, because you've stopped defining yourself through their reactions. When someone misunderstands you, you don't rush to correct the record. When someone is upset with you, you don't scramble to repair it unless you've determined the relationship warrants that effort. When someone is trying to provoke a reaction, you notice it and decline to provide one. This isn't sociopathy. It's just a very clear boundary between your internal state and others' attempts to influence it through emotional leverage. You've become expensive to move, which means people either respect the stillness or they go find someone easier to push around. The final recognition is that most of what people call communication is actually just mutual anxiety management. Two people talking, each trying to ensure the other doesn't think poorly of them, both performing a version of themselves they believe is acceptable, neither particularly interested in what the other is actually saying. When you stop participating in this, the interaction either deepens into something real or it dissolves into nothing. There's very little middle ground. Silence is a filter that removes the middle. What's left is either substantial or absent, and you've made peace with both outcomes in a way that people still trapped in the anxiety economy can't quite understand. They think you're withholding something they're entitled to. You've just stopped pretending the exchange was ever equal to begin with.